Hi, I'm Adrian Sims from LearnCIMA.com. We're going to look at the important topic of change leadership. This is one of the topics in the E3 examination, which counts for 20% of the marks of the examination itself. It's also, when you do strategic case study, a very important set of skills. It feeds into the leadership competence of the strategic case study. Change leadership. The first thing you have to recognize is, well, what are the triggers for change in an organization? Imagine that someone left where you worked 5 years ago and they come back for a visit, perhaps to have lunch with you. And the first thing they say is, well, what sort of things have changed around here? Now, you inside the organization might not have noticed, but they're going to see all sorts of changes. And then they'll ask you, well, what do you think about the organization these days? Is it getting better than it was or worse? And that's what change leadership is about. Making those changes happen and ensuring the organization is better as a consequence. Now, the first thing to consider is, what are the triggers for change? The triggers for change can be indirect. They come from the environment of the business. And one handy way to think about them is using the PEST mnemonic: political and legal, economic, social and technological. So new laws, a change of government policy, that can change the environment of the business, and the business has to respond. There could be economic changes. There's been a boom, and therefore the company's got many, many more staff and a very full order book. Or there's been a recession, and the company's now got a small order book. Or possibly through globalization, it's outsourced a lot of its business to a different country. A trigger for change can also be external and direct. This means from the competitive environment of the company. And here, Porter's 5 competitive forces is a useful checklist. Has there been a change in the competitive rivalry of the industry so that companies are having to, for example, reduce costs in a significant way? And that making them to try to maybe outsource product production or try to find ways of reducing manpower levels. Has there been a change in the power of customers? Has there been a change in the power of suppliers? Perhaps there have been new entrants to the market that your company is going to have to respond to. And finally, substitute technologies that may be challenging the very existence of the industry and forcing your company to copy it or do things in a different way. Now, change can also come from internal triggers. For example, a change in the philosophy of the company as to what it's trying to achieve. For example, new management might arrive with new ideas. There can also be a reorganization of a company, perhaps following a merger. That again is a trigger for change. Changes in personnel and your work team will also affect the way the organization works. There might also be changes in the way the business does its work. For example, it has started to outsource or utilize e-commerce. And finally, the technology the business uses may have changed, a deliberate attempt perhaps to mechanize more tasks. So these triggers for change are going to lead people inside the organization to welcome the new ways of working or possibly to resist them. Beluga and Hope Haley produce a model which tries to categorize change into 2 key dimensions. The first dimension is the extent of the change. Is this change simply a realignment? That means an overdue adjustment to the business according to the circumstances around it. Or is it more radical than that? Is this a transformation of the business? I think you can see that transformational change is likely to lead to greater concern and require much more shrewd management than continuously realigning the business slowly and in small steps. Speaking of steps, that's the second dimension of their model. What is the speed of the change? Is it something that's being done incrementally so that management can actually take this in small steps and not offend too many people? Or is it something which is going to be done as a big bang all at once? Now, taking these 2 dimensions, Beluga and Hope Haley refer to 4 types of change situation. There is an adaptation, which is a incremental change done slowly, the least unsettling. There is also the revolutionary change, which is the most unsettling. It is a transformation of the business done in a big bang. And then around those 2, you have an evolutionary change, which is over time radically changing the business, but at the time no one really notices. And then we have the reconstructive change, which is something done quickly, but because it's only a realignment, is relatively minor. Now, in the E3 objective test questions, you might be asked to assign the terminology for the change to the various quadrants of the diagram. Or you might be asked your opinion upon a scenario as to which type of change it is. In the strategic case study, these kind of terminologies are part of the business skills competence of the examination. So they're useful to have these terms at your fingertips to gain marks in the exam. Now, a lot of change talks about the organisational culture. Organisational culture is the values, the attitudes, the norms and the expectations of the business and the people within it. Now, this culture is important to strategic management for two reasons. In one way, the culture of the business acts as a filter, which means that the management sometimes respond to external events in the environment in different ways according to the culture of the business. For example, an airline might look at its environment and say, well, people always want to fly as a luxury, and completely misunderstand that people have started to want to also fly for cheap flights. Their culture has forbidden them to see what's really happening outside their business. And that immediately means the company can't really respond very quickly. But even if management do want the company to respond, the problem is the culture of the company is a very slow-moving thing. It's like an oil tanker. It's got a momentum of its own. It's moving very slowly, but it's very, very hard to change its direction. And the culture of a company can be an obstruction to an organisation's ability to adapt its behaviour to cope with its environment. So many people, therefore, talk about where does organisational culture come from, because this is what's going to need to change if the organisation is going to change. And this brings us to the cultural web. The cultural web is also in the E3 syllabus, and there will be questions upon it in the objective test question bank. The cultural web doesn't refer to the phrase culture, it calls it the organisational paradigm and values. And it says that it's sustained by a number of factors. Some of these factors are relatively hard and identifiable. For example, you can see the power structure of the organisation. Who is the boss and who is not? Who are the leaders? Who is led? The organisational structure, the tasks and roles of the organisation, the ways in which the teams work together and who runs them. You'd also have to look at things like, for example, whether or not you have a matrix structure, a divisional structure, a functional structure, or whatever. The control systems are very easy to see as well, the way in which we control people. For example, are there time cards when people come in? Do people keep their time logged in 10-minute blocks on a spreadsheet during the day? Or is the control more used by training and development and culture? Those are the hard elements. But there are also some rather strange elements that also sustain the culture and the cultural web. For example, the symbols of power, the symbols of the company. For example, if you notice all the executives have parking spaces next to the main front door of the offices, it tells you something about who's powerful and who's not in the organisation. There are also stories and myths. You work in the organisation for a couple of months or a couple of years, and you hear all these stories of things that have happened in the past, and myths about things that went right and went wrong. Now, these stories and myths might not be true, but the fact you hear them and learn them means they kind of take on a truth of their own. They become like urban legends that says something about the organisation. And finally, the routines and rituals of the business. They're nothing to do with actually doing the work. They're just part of being part of the organisation. And routines and rituals can be things like how you address people. Is it Mr. this and Miss that, or is it first names? Or do you use people's familiar names and nicknames? Routines and rituals can be things like when you take your holidays. Routines and rituals can be things like whether or not you have got social gatherings inside the business or not. Now, these are all part of the cultural web. And the point is that these are the factors that support the present paradigm of the business, its present way of working. And in change leadership, these are the things you have to change to make the organisation change its culture. Kurt Lewin is known for two very significant models of change management. The first one is called the ice cube model, or sometimes called the three-step approach. And the story goes that Kurt Lewin was being asked by his wife to prepare for a dinner party, and they wanted to ice the watermelon. So he goes to the refrigerator and collects the ice cubes and realizes to ice the watermelon he has to break all these ice cubes up. And in frustration, probably because ice cubes are all over the floor, Kurt Lewin says, well, it would be easier, quite honestly, to melt these ice cubes back into water again, put them around the watermelon and just refreeze them. Now, it sounds ridiculous, but that made Kurt Lewin think, well, that's an analogy for changing an organisation. Now, I don't want to present Kurt Lewin as a man who only knew about watermelons. He actually was a lecturer in management dynamics at Stanford University. This was his specialist topic. So he talked about the need to change an organisation as a three-step approach. As you can see, the first step is to unfreeze the behaviour of the organisation at the moment. As you can see, the first stage is to unfreeze the organisation's behaviour as it is at the moment. And that's called the initiation stage, or the unfreezing stage. This means drawing people's attention to the problems of the organisation and why it needs to change. The second stage is a change of change. And change involves a number of behaviours. You need people to adopt new ways of working, and you need people to adapt their existing ways of working to fit with what the organisation needs them to do. And this has appeared perhaps when training is taking place, when jobs are being redesigned, when departments are being redesigned. Then you have to make it stick. So the third stage is called refreezing. And during the refreezing stage, the organisation takes on its new shape. There's a general acceptance of the new ways of working and values of the business. Those are used in day-to-day work, and they're incorporated into the control systems of the business. And that's a three-stage model. Now, Kurt Lewin was actually a psychodynamic psychologist. And before he went into organisational studies, he spent a lot of time looking at other situations of human change. And this particular one, called the force field, was actually developed by Kurt Lewin to explain the problems of children as they become adolescents. And then after a while he realised once again that this model could be generalised into a model of organisational change. Now here he talks about a force field. And what he means is that people caught up in a situation of change are caught up in a dynamic tension between what they are currently doing, the current state of organisation, and what they want the organisation state to become in the future. And this dynamic tension involves them in two sets of opposing forces. There are driving forces, that are the forces that make the change necessary, and these could be the will to make a change, they could be management pressure, competition, pressure from shareholders, pressure from the law, pressure from the triggers we talked about earlier. And there are resisting forces, and these are things that make change difficult. Now, because he's a psychologist, Lewin sees these mostly as being personal resisting forces, people within the organisation or organised groups who don't want to go along with the changed way of working. And what Lewin suggests is that change can only be effective if management try to address the dynamic tension by addressing both groups of forces. They need to strengthen the driving forces, as it were, to force the line slightly towards the desired state, but at the same time addressing the resisting forces. Now, one problem with Kurt Lewin's work is it's very conceptual. It doesn't give you a clear idea of how to do it. That clear idea was given by a pair called Kotter and Schlesinger. But before we come to them, we need very briefly to look at a pair called Beer and Naraya, who also appear in the E3 syllabus, and they might also be a subject for question. Beer and Naraya look at different sorts of change situations, and they classified some as being a theory E situation of change, and others as a theory O. Now, a theory E situation of change means theory economic, and this is a kind of change that might happen shortly after a takeover bid, when the new owners are trying to find ways of improving the financial control of a business or performance of a business. So this is very much about trying to strip out unnecessary activities in order to reduce costs and boost profits. The kind of corporate raider change, if you will. Now, Beer and Naraya point out that has very many good short-term effects, but it will not grow a good long-term business. Theory O is theory organisational, And this they see as being a deeper and more sustainable sort of change. This is where the organisation does not just simply take an accounting view of change, stripping out costs and removing slack from the business. Rather, it looks at trying to develop participative approaches with management to try and generate innovation to make the company better in the longer term. Now, obviously, Beer and Naraya appear to be more in favour of theory O than theory E, but you must recognise in a question, particularly in a case study question, sometimes there's not enough time to allow a theory O approach. If a company is going broke, if a company's got a cash flow problem, now is not the time to start gathering together and having a party. Now is the time to start thinking about theory E. So theory E is essentially a short-term approach, theory O is a longer-term approach. I mentioned Kotter and Schlesinger. Kotter and Schlesinger did lots and lots of work at looking at how change was done in real organisations. They came up with 6 different approaches that management can use. And think of it like a painter's palette. These 6 can be combined in different ways to make the change happen. One approach is education and communication. Tell people why the change is needed, give them the skills they're going to need to do their new jobs. Communicate to them what's happening. This avoids rumours, it makes things clearer. Participation involvement is actually asking the people affected by the change to take some kind of involvement with it. And in the strategic management papers we've been looking at here, this is the idea of asking divisional managers to also be involved in changing the kind of organisation and possibly even lower down, right down to the work group. It will lead to more acceptance, but also it might lead to better ideas because obviously top management don't have all the answers. Facilitation and support is very much a change management approach that's based upon trying to help people understand why change is happening and giving them support at crucial points over what could be quite a psychologically difficult process. Change agents and people involved in organisational development will tend to be the experts at facilitation and support approaches. Now, not all change is going to be wanted by everybody. Sometimes you want to reduce number of staff, sometimes you want to change working hours, sometimes you want to change people's jobs. And people don't want that. So there may need to be negotiation and agreement. And negotiation agreement means management come along saying what they want, the affected staff say what they require, and somewhere along the line there's some give and take, and we come to a solution in the middle that both sides can actually live with. Thinking back to your stakeholder analysis, a lot of that is about negotiation and agreement. The final 2 in the Kotter and Schlesinger model are regarded by CIMA as being unethical. And there have been objective test questions asking you to identify the unethical elements of Kotter and Schlesinger. This is where we are using people to make the change happen by lying to them, or manipulating them in some particular way, or by bullying them. And the first unethical approach is called manipulation and co-optation. This is where you find particular individuals and you effectively tell them lies to make them go forward and tell your lies on your behalf. Or you co-opt the difficult person into the change team to keep them quiet. Of course, once the change has happened, you sack them. That's not ethical. Coercion, bullying, can be implicit, a threat. If you don't do this, you haven't got a job. Or it can be explicit. Coercion, that means bullying people, can be implicit, making people realise that if they don't go along with the change, maybe their career is going to be damaged. Or explicit, you simply tell them if they don't do it, they haven't got a job. Once again, this is regarded as unethical because it's an unethical use of management power to make things happen. But of course, outside of the ethics, sometimes in business, this is all you can do. So these 6 strategies have been used by managers and they can be very successful. Finally, Kotter again. The E3 syllabus has got change management in it, but it also has a topic called change leadership. Now, Kotter, who wrote the original material we saw with Schlesinger, a management approach, began to realise that leadership was more important than he first realised. And he wrote a seminal work called Leading Change. And the point he made was that really the essence of leadership in a business is leading people to do things that are different from what they do at the moment. And he says anything else is purely management, it's making the same thing happen year after year after year. So a person who says they've got 10 years experience may actually, of course, be someone who's got 10 years of experiencing the same thing year after year after year. Leadership is about taking the business forward. And this approach of change leadership, Kotter talks about 3 important phases. And this is very clearly in the E3 syllabus. Firstly, creating a climate for change. Now you can think a little bit as this might be like Lewin again, the unfreezing stage. But this is leadership. What is the role of senior management at this point? Firstly, they have to create a sense of urgency. They've got to make people think this has got to happen. They've got to start painting threats and say if we don't fix things, then the company will be swamped by events. They'll create a powerful coalition, bring about them a group of people who can make things happen. That coalition might be key members of management themselves. It could also be key external stakeholders. Then a vision for change is created. That means some kind of idea of what they're trying to achieve. Think of this as rather like some kind of polar explorer who says, we're going to walk across the North Pole and we're trying to find the North Pole, the vision, we're trying to go there. They're not giving a detailed account of what's going to happen on every step of the journey. The second phase is to engage and enable the organisation. That means to socialise the change into the rest of the staff. So you need to communicate the vision lower down, below the coalition for change, below senior management. They also need to empower action by giving resources, giving time, giving training. And then, to try and make people think it's really happening, try to engineer some quick wins. Things can happen quickly to give a sense of momentum to the change experience. So people aren't cynical. They might have seen many failed change approaches in the past. This time, things are really happening. And that can be visual artifacts like a change in the company logo or new uniforms or a new name or maybe a few key client wins that people say, oh, look, things really are getting better now. Once things are moving, we have to implement and sustain the change. So we got to build on the change and get further wins. And finally, we have to make it stick. And that means we've got to stop the organisation going back into its old ways. So it has to be celebrated as being the new way of working the organisation. So we began with the triggers for change, why organisations might need to change, and we've ended with a very leadership-led approach to making change happen. Now, in the E3 objective test questions, you might have very detailed questions on particular parts of each of these models, so you need to learn them. In the case study examination, you don't get detailed questions on parts of models, but you need to talk about how you would use them in a report to management, about what management should do to lead change. And of course, this is why change management and change leadership is one of the key competences of management accountants, and it is 25% of the marks in your final CIMA examination.